Welcome to the Exploress, time traveling through history, one era at a time. I'm Kate Armstrong. I hope you enjoyed our episodes on women and prohibition. We'll be doing a day in the 1920s life very soon here on the Exploress. But in this episode, we're jumping back a decade to 1910 Chicago, which is the setting of my friend Krystal Marquis' New York Times and indie bestselling novel, The Davenports. This heartwarming historical romance introduces us to four young Black women navigating life at the turn of the century, falling in love, taking risks, and carving their own paths through the world. I loved talking to Krystal about her research and her inspiration, and I hope you do too. Now, grab a fancy yellow hat and that can-do attitude. Let's go traveling. But first, a shout out to some of my patrons. My warrior queens, Sophia, Alexis, Amanda, Kate, Ika, June, Neve and Sloan, and Samantha. My imperial empresses, Katie, Bridget, Faye and Whimsy Soapworks, Samara, and Teresa. And my Lady Pharaohs, Cheryl, Sophie, Kot, Kate, Laura, Lewis, and the fabulous Courtneys. Patrons play a huge role in keeping this show going. They support an independent creator, and they get access to exclusive bonus episodes, contests, the yearly Exploress calendar, full interviews with my guests, and more. To find out all about it, just go to my website. Hi, Krystal. Welcome to the Exploress. Thanks for coming on.
Hi, Kate. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, listeners probably won't know this, but you and I we are publishing house sisters. You
Yes.
came, I think the Davenports came out, roughly a month before Nightbirds. So I feel like you've been
Yeah.
breaking trail for me. It's been really fun watching you bring the Davenports out into the world and talk about it and celebrate it. And obviously it's doing so well and finding a huge audience, which is so well deserved because it's an amazing book and I can't wait for my listeners to read it.
Thank you. It's definitely been an adventure, and I've been very excited and happy to share the story with readers and just to find that bond of sisterhood is really resonating with a lot of readers. So that's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it is amazing. I love that the story is really centered around these incredibly strong women who find strength in each other. So, how about we start with having you pitch the Davenports for us?
Yes, so The Davenports is a story of four young Black women growing up in 1910 Chicago. The Davenport family are one of the few wealthy Black families during that time. Their father had escaped enslavement in Virginia and founded this really successful carriage company. At the center of the story are the three Davenport children, John, Olivia, and Helen. Olivia and Helen are two of the point of views that we get from the story. The other point of views is Ruby, who is Olivia's best friend, and Amy Rose, who is a maid in the Davenport household. So as these young women are trying to, navigate that coming of age over a course of a spring, they are falling in love and they are getting challenged about what they want their futures to be. Olivia is all set to get married and settle down, but then she meets this young activist who kind of opened her eyes to some of the struggle other Black Americans are having. And then Helen doesn't want to get married at all. She wants a part in her family's carriage company. She wants to be a mechanic. And Amy Rose, even though she works adjacent to the Davenports, she's a maid and she has this idea of opening her own business, even though it's not something that women were typically doing at that time. It was still very, you know, um, unique for a woman to start her own business. And then Ruby is in love with John and she is trying to catch him through her own type of scheming. And then she finds herself, kind of confused about where her heart should go. So it's very fun watching these young girls kind of navigate first love as they grow up.
Yes. And at such an interesting time in American history, I feel like I just have so many questions because you've written a book about such complex, interesting women who are living in a time where there are a lot of barriers to women and especially to Black women trying to navigate the world and carve their own paths. So I have lots of questions, but let's start at the beginning. I'm really interested in what came first for you, the story about these characters, or did you start with history? Because I know I've heard you talk before about how the Davenports are in many ways based on a real life family. So can you tell us a little bit about that, where your inspiration came from?
Yeah, so the Davenports is inspired by C.R. Patterson and Sons Carriage Company. It was founded by C.R. Patterson, who was, like Mr. Davenport, an escaped slave who created his own business after finding success as a blacksmith. And it was his son Frederick who converted it to an automobile company. So the history came first. I saw an article of Frederick Patterson, his son, standing in front of an automobile. He had a three-piece suit, a bowler hat, and he was just posed like very dashing. And below it was first and only Black-owned car company. And I stopped myself and I looked at it and I was like, wait, I didn't know that was a thing. I didn't know that there was a carriage company or a car company created by a Black family. And so that started my wheels turning. I like cars. My dad and I have worked on two Mustangs that, we tinkered with. And for me, as someone who liked cars, I didn't know about this history. And that's really what started was trying to figure out how this happened and how this story kind of got lost in the years of education and history that I'd taken in school. So it was not until I saw the article at the Smithsonian that mentioned he had daughters that I dug a little deeper. And Mr. Patterson had three daughters, Dorothea, Kate, and Mary. And their names I only found after weeks of like trying to spend like odd couple of minutes here and there trying to research this family and this story. And to know that it was that difficult to find their names, it was even more difficult to find out what their lives were like. And so the Davenports is a little bit of me filling in those gaps and just my curiosity of how difficult it would be to live in that gray space of being a woman of color, but having wealth. So some doors were still closed to you while others, you had access to, whereas some of your peers would not. And
Mm.
I think from there, it just blossomed into something bigger.
Yes, it's interesting to hear you talking about going searching for the stories of those women and actually having a hard time finding them. That
Mhm.
to me feels like the the central theme that runs through all of women's history is
Yes.
I've never heard about this. Why haven't I ever heard about this? Why is it so hard to find information about these women? That's definitely, if there was a thesis statement for the Exploress, that would be it.
It was very strange because they mentioned he had daughters in several articles before I actually found their names. So, yeah, it's
Mm.
definitely why haven't I heard of this? And, you're
Hmm. Yeah, and interesting that obviously this was a man of consequence, wealth and
mhm,
consequence, and so you'd think his daughters would have been also of wealth and consequence, but it just really tells you something about the time that their names aren't even mentioned because they're not considered of particular consequence, right?
mhm.
Ah, history. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the research that you did because, I'm really in awe of the story you've told and of anyone who's writing historical fiction because to dive into the past and to create a story that feels authentic and feels like this is what the world would have been like for these women And like you say, having to fill in the gaps of their experience and what they might have, the things they might have seen and heard and gone through. I think that's a particular kind of challenge for any writer. And so I'm really interested to hear, how did you actually go about doing that? What sorts of research did you do about the 1910s and about Chicago? And what did you find that you found interesting or surprising?
Yeah, so the research I did started out with that Smithsonian article. And it was from there that I kind of clicked from link to link, article to article, trying to fill in those gaps. It was much easier to find information about the carriage company and then the automobile company than it was about the daughters and about women of that time. And even Mr. Patterson, he lived in Ohio. And it was in my research, I kept seeing Chicago pop up. There was protests in Chicago, there was wealth in Chicago, there was a lot of change. And along my writing and my drafting, it felt more true to have the story set in Chicago. That way I can pull in those little snippets of history that was, revealing themselves to me. And fortunately for me, that Chicago Public Library had so many primary sources, so many different articles and photographs of Chicago during that time. I looked at maps of the city from 1910 and different buildings they erected, ones that they had demolished. There was newspaper clippings of major events. So that was a lot of fun. I did get lost a few times. I like to say that as someone who shops a lot in like shoes and accessories, I got a little lost in some of the fashion articles, but it was a lot of fun looking at the dresses and the hats and yellow silk has a theme throughout my story and it inspired my cover, which is like very gold and very shiny. So it was a lot of fun getting lost in that. And I want to say that for every barrier that I hit on finding information on like one particular topic, um, I found going back to Chicago in the city that kind of really opened up the doors of more information that I could find.
Yeah, it makes total sense to me that you would set it in a city because, yes, I imagine from a research point of view, Chicago around that time, there was so much happening. Such an
Mhm.
interesting place to be in terms of industry and society. And it wasn't sort of the stuffy East Coast that was very fixed in its ways. It was like a little wilder, and an entrepreneur could kind of, I think it was a place that felt like it was full of opportunity for lots of people. Obviously, there were lots of barriers too. So, in researching Chicago around that time, was there anything that you found particularly surprising or that you were like, especially around women's lives or fashion? Because anyone who listens to the Exploress knows I love talking about historical fashion. So, so interesting. But was there anything that you found that really surprised you?
So I was surprised that there were a lot of instances of Black wealth and Black entrepreneurship, and that really caught my eye. And, you know, even though it was not based in Chicago, Amy Rose's character is inspired by Madam C.J. Walker, and I was so excited when I was writing that Netflix had that, mini series about her, and I got to watch that. So I was like,
Yeah.
"Ooh, there's the clothes and the hair care line." So it was really fun to have, that visual that what's the word I'm looking for? Just like a visual source of information where I can look to and draw inspiration from that. And it was just very interesting to have that accompany some of the articles that I was reading. It was adding another layer to the story. And to find out that she was also a millionaire from her own work was so surprising. And it really helped me think, okay, so there are instances where women were looking at needs of other women. People weren't making a lot of hair care products. There were barber shops and there
Mm.
was industry, but they were mostly catered to men. They were the ones that had a lot of the money. But also during this time, there was this transition where women were going out into the workforce, that they had their own money and they had their own interests and what they wanted to spend it on. So it was very interesting to kind of watch that transition. And I think, especially for Amy Rose and even Helen, who, because of her family's wealth, she kind of has that protection to venture out into the garage with her brother and tinker on the carriages and the automobiles that he brings home. And I think that was very
Mhm.
interesting to explore.
Yes, it was such, I mean, you've chosen to write about a time of such interesting transition in America,
Hmm.
for women and also for Black Americans. I mean, as you say, the patriarch of the family is very much a self-made man, and he
Hmm.
started his life in enslavement and has gone from that life to, developing his skills as a blacksmith and then becoming this wealthy man in the community, and all of that in one life. I mean, I just can't even imagine having that journey,
Yeah.
and America is having that journey too, right? And there's
Hmm.
still, I mean, I want to talk a little bit about centering this Black family and these Black women. It's really a story about them. I mean, it's hard to tell a story about Black Americans in the 1910s without
Yeah.
talking about prejudice and without talking about the kinds of the racism and really difficult conversations and barriers they're facing. I mean, you open the novel with a scene in which one of the daughters goes to a department store and has this really uncomfortable back and forth with, a female clerk behind the counter who's kind of like, what are you doing here? And, there's like the racist implications about you don't belong here. You must not have the money to be able to shop here. Who are you shopping
Hmm.
for? And I love, like, the exchange is great because, she very much comes back at this shop girl, like, and puts her in her place, and it's great. But it's like from the very opening pages of the novel, we get a sense of what it means for these women to be moving through the world, even with money, even with privilege. So what were you thinking about when you started to craft their stories? And were there historical aspects, you know, from this period that you were drawing on? What were you thinking about when you were centering these Black women in this story in this time?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite scenes, and it was one of the first ones that I wrote. It was a lot of fun to write. I found that in school, you learn a lot about the Civil War, but then I feel like
Mm,
nothing gets really covered until the civil rights movement. So there's like this huge 100-year period where there's very little information that's shared about it. So I think centering the story around the four young women that I chose allowed me to show the different classes and the different encounters that they would have. For example, you mentioned Olivia in the shop. That is one aspect where you get to see her wealth and her class being leveraged to establish, I belong here. And even though she has this wealth and she is of a higher class, it still doesn't protect her from the prejudice that she kind of has to endure just to go out shopping. And I think that was really important to convey. And I think having Amy Rose, who is a maid in their household, kind of gave me a little bit more freedom because she is able to interact with more people and people of different classes. And I think women could get to travel through the world in spaces that are often overlooked. And that was really what drove me to write the story in the first place. This is a time period that is often overlooked. And I think one of the things that helped drive the story was moving up the Great Migration. And that's a period of time where there were a lot of Black Americans moving from the South to the North where there is more opportunity. And even though the book deals with a lot of heavy topics, like I do mention the riots in Springfield that happened in 1908, it was a time where Black Americans were able to accumulate wealth, were able to build businesses and create Black Wall Streets that were thriving. And they created their own cultures little cities within cities that really help influence and shape the country. And I think having strong and educated young women in the household kind of uplifts everyone. And that was something that I really wanted to focus on.
And I love that about the book. You're right. I don't this is a period of time that often gets overlooked, and I think especially when we're talking about the history of Black Americans, this so much of your book is centered on stories that mirror real people, but they're not stories that we hear a lot about. And I think, as you say, it was a really interesting and wonderful choice to center women from different classes who are kind of moving in different social circles so that we can kind of begin to get a fuller picture of the kinds of things they're experiencing. And it's not all about trauma and struggle and prejudice. It's also about romance and love
Mhm,
and sisterhood and, lifting each other up and sort of um, carving their own paths through the world, even though they're not easy. So I really love that about the book. It is a joy to read
mhm.
and to follow these women.
That was one of my favorite things is that each of these girls have their own passion and they pursue it. And their male suitors are very supportive of that. It's very much something that was important to me to tell. And also the way that they support each other. They're very they're very supportive and encouraging. And I love the friendships between Olivia and Ruby and Helen and Amy Rose is just yes, do what makes you happy, keep going, and yeah, that was a lot of fun.
I'm also really interested in so this business, the family business, is in carriages. And
Yeah.
obviously, this is 1910. So
Mhm,
there's, and you sense this from the very beginning of the novel, that there's already this friction between, we've done carriages for a really long time, but we're looking to the future and automobiles are starting to become a thing. And how are we going to transition from one to the other? It's a threat to the business, and there's this notion that we have to move with the younger generation, and the son of
mhm.
the family is like, we have to move with the times, and dad's
Yeah.
like, this is how I made my fortune and we're going to keep doing it the old fashioned way. So what I know, you said you were interested in cars, and that's
Mhm.
definitely apparent in the novel, but what what were you thinking about when you brought that storyline into the novel, and what interested you about that?
I really like the idea of Helen finding something to bond with her brother, um, on. So John Davenport isn't one of the 4 points of view, so you really learn about him through his interactions with his siblings and then Ruby and Amy Rose. And John and Helen spent a lot of time in the garage tinkering on this automobile that he brought home. They don't know where he got it from, but it's in need of some tender love and care. And I think it was really fun to have Helen be this savant of engineering who just kind of goes in, reads the plans, and just has this innate talent to repair vehicles and machinery and just really figure out how things work. And, as a girl who's interested in cars, you always get this feeling like, oh, you're not supposed to know this, or people try and question you. And to have this young girl be so confident in her own ability was really the driving force behind her character. And I think it also points to the ingenuity of young women. It's not without it's not because of their gender that they don't know or they're incapable. And even during this time period, it's important to highlight that these girls did have all these different talents that may have been overlooked. I think I was reading online recently and I saw an article about the sister of the Wright brothers, and I feel so bad that I'm blanking on her first name right now. But she was a very important part of them being able to, make that breakthrough and first flight. And she traveled with them and helped set up all their meetings and wrote their speeches. And it was just really important in putting like the Wright family on the map as these aero I don't know, aeronautical, is that a word? I think so.
That sounds right.
But yeah, like, she was such an important part of their success, and it was I didn't know that she was at all involved. You just hear, "Oh, the Wright brothers and the first flight," and
Hmm.
she was just as important to the whole outfit as they were. So, for me, it's really important to highlight that women were engineers at this time too. Even though we didn't hear about them, they were out there doing that work.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think so often they go unremarked upon and they're almost invisible because there were these social expectations about what women were allowed to do and not do. So they were often these like silent partners who were influential behind the scenes but weren't given the public credit because it somehow threatens the status quo about men are in the public sphere and men are the ones leading businesses and the women are the helpmates and the supporters
Yeah.
behind the scenes when, as you say, so often they were instrumental. They, of course, they had
Mhm.
brilliant ideas, they were inventors, they were engineers, they had lots of passions that they contributed to their families, but it's almost like it just got subsumed by that public male face, which is very frustrating, very frustrating.
Yes. Yes, definitely. And I think Helen's relationship with her father is very complicated because she's so passionate and she's so poor at hiding it. He he always knows when she's been out in the garage, even though she's like, I washed my hands so many times. He can always tell when she's been out there. And I think that is kind of relatable. I think that young women sometimes have these passions or, these interests that are not considered feminine, and they feel like they
Mhm.
have to hide. And for her to be so determined to continue to pursue it, even though it's not something her family would want for her, I think is very courageous.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm always in reading about women in history in all different time periods. I'm always so in awe of what these women were willing to do to follow their passions. We have a lot more opportunities to follow them now than most women in history. And it is incredible to think about the courage and the self belief it took to be able to go
Hmm.
on these unconventional paths. Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of feminism and women doing great things, um, so obviously this is a fictional story and it's set more than 100 years ago. But I certainly saw a lot of parallels between the struggles and frustrations that your characters face and the ones that women face now. So, were you thinking, do you see those parallels too? And what were you thinking about in terms of making this historical story relatable to readers now?
Yeah, I do see those struggles now. I feel that just as in 1910, a lot of women were, marching for the right to vote. They were looking for equality in the workplace. They were looking for better working conditions. And I think about I work for a company that has good maternity leave, but I know friends who don't. And then there are, other ways that I feel like women's rights are in danger. And I think that that is a parallel to now, and these 4 girls, they're looking at the limitations of their time, and they're trying to find ways around it, and I think for women today, they are looking for ways of preserving what we have, and also looking to expand that to look for equality, not just for, women who identify as women, and people of all different diverse groups. I think equality is definitely something that people are looking to protect and to preserve, and I think that is a very much a theme of my book, that they're looking for this fair chance at the American dream and pursuing their own dreams and following their own passions.
Yes, yes. And I
Mhm.
was thinking about all of that too as I wrote my very different fantasy novel that centers women and female friendships. I
Mhm.
think it's hard, even when you're writing something that's firmly historical. I imagine you're always thinking about the past and the present. And I think the Davenports, um, it is really joyful, and it centers these women doing incredible things, really interesting characters, but it also talks about the frustrations that they face in trying to pursue their passions and live the lives they want to lead. And that to me felt so relevant to the present day. Listeners, if you haven't read The Davenports yet, you need to run out and get it immediately. It is wonderful. And Krystal, I believe that there are going to be some more books in the Davenports series. Is that right? How many?
Yes,
How
that's
many can
right.
we expect to look forward to?
Oh, I don't know how many yet, but there are definitely more books to come. I'm currently working on book two, and I'm really excited for where it's going and the different changes that the young girls and challenges that they'll find. And yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yes. Well, before I let you go, I ask all my guests this question, and I'm very interested to hear your answer. So, if you could time travel back for a day to any time and any place in history, where would you go?
So I'm going to feel like a little bit of a cheat with this answer because your previous guest, Alyssa, and I were on a panel together and we had this discussion. We also love ancient Egypt. I'm a huge Elizabeth Peters fan, and her Amelia Peabody series about the Amelia Peabody, who is an Egyptologist. Even though women weren't allowed to be that, she was like, I got my inheritance. I'm going to go anyway. Um, I fell in love with ancient Egypt in that book series, and I always wanted to go back to when Queen Hatshepsut was ruling as pharaoh. So after her husband
Yes.
died, she becomes regent. Then she names herself pharaoh, and she kind of rules until her stepson um, takes over. And I think she was responsible for so much of what we still see in Egypt now. Like the columns at the
Hmm.
Temple of Karnak was built under her reign. And I think she was a warrior queen who learned a lot from her father, who was a warrior king. And I just thought it would be so interesting to kind of see what we think of as Egypt being built during her time. And yeah, I think that would be
Hmm.
a lot of fun.
Yeah, I would love that. That's definitely in my top five. I would love to go back to her royal court and her
Hmm.
incredible palace, by the river, and just to
Yes.
see what she created, and to be able to see her. Oh, yeah, that's a great
Yeah.
pick. I love it. I'll go with
Hmm.
you. When a time
Yeah. Okay.
travel machine is invented and we can do it, we will go. We will go there, and then we can take Lissa with us and go and see ancient
Oh, that'll be
Alexandria,
so
meet
fun.
Cleopatra as well.
Yeah.
Oh, that sounds great.
Yes.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Krystal, for joining us on the Exploress and talking about the Davenports.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun, and I'm so looking forward to finishing the Nightbirds. And yeah, I'm just so excited for people to read our books.
Thanks for listening, and thank you so much to Krystal for joining us. You'll find the Davenports wherever books are sold, and you can find out more about Krystal at her website, Krystal Marquis, spelled Marquis.com. There are lots of ways to support the Exploress. Tell a friend about it, leave a review wherever you listen, become a patron, or just send me an email telling me what you love about the show. I really love hearing from listeners. You'll find show notes and lots of women's history resources at my website, theexploresspodcast.com. If you want to find me on socials, it's most likely to be on Instagram at The Exploress Podcast. Until next time.